Our CodeCamper application is about an event, and as such, we want to be able to add sessions and speakers, not just edit them. So in this module, we'll learn how we can add data and save it back to the database using Breeze. We'll have to have a way to get from the session screen where we can add a session and then route over to the editing screen, which will also serve as a dual purpose for adding new entities, or speakers or sessions in this case. So we'll take a look at some routing techniques to be able to differentiate between edits and adds. And before we can add something to the database, we have to be able to create that entity on the client. We'll see how Breeze makes this really easy for us. We'll also take a look at some techniques where we can manage how we do drop-down selections, so we always have a select a speaker or a select a room, for example, somewhere in our drop-down list. And that'll just help us improve the user experience and make sure we always have related objects in the entity graph. And we'll be using something called the null object pattern to show this. And of course, we'll do this for both sessions and speakers, so now we can edit them and add them both. Well, let's dig in. Before we dive into the code, let's make sure we understand the user experience that we want to have when we actually create and add the records. First, we're going to start off with routing from a list like sessions or speakers over to the view where we're going to edit the object. So we'll have to add some kind of an add button over on the session screen. And when we click that, we want to route over to another view. We could actually reuse the editing view for sessions. It's the same information. We'll just modify it a little to work for adding. For example, one thing we'll do is we'll change the title to say new session if it's a new session. And we're getting the benefit of things like change tracking, which we already had in place. Notice the asterisk next to the save button. And the key here is we're going to reuse the editing screen for an add screen using routing parameters. So instead of passing in session ID number 1 or 2, so we can edit that item, instead we'll pass in a word like new. And we'll examine that routing parameter when we receive it on the session details screen. And if we identify it as a new object that we want to create, then we're going to take advantage of some of the features of Breeze. Specifically, the Entity Manager has a create entity method on it. And then you pass to it the name of the entity that you want to create. So we might say session. And then the create entity method will create a new entity of that type. So we're going to get a new session object. And remember we defined those constructors inside the model.js? Well, this process is going to take advantage of that, so any additional properties that we use to extend the model will also get created on the entity. For example, if we had an isSpeaker or the isPartial properties that we created, those will get tacked on as well. In the end, we'll get the same kind of entity that we had as if we were editing a session, except this one happens to be new. So now that we know how the user experience should work and how to create one of these entities, let's go do it. We need a way to get to our view so we can add the speaker. So let's go into the speakers view and we'll add a button there so we can route over to the adding a speaker view. First, we'll just copy this refresh button that we had, and instead of using an ng click here, we actually don't even need a directive to do the routing. Instead, we'll stick in an href and we'll send that over to speaker/new. We already have a speaker route, and now instead of passing in an ID of like 13 or some other number, we're going to pass in the word new. That's going to indicate that this is going to be adding a speaker. And of course, we don't want an icon refresh. Instead, we'll use a different icon. There's one called plus, and then the word we'll put on it is going to be add a speaker. And that's all we have to do in the speakers HTML. Now we have to have a way to receive that parameter. So let's go into the speaker detail, and inside of here in the JavaScript, we're going to receive that parameter. And to do that, we're going to use Angular's route param service, which we already have right here. So first things first, let's go down into where we actually parse that parameter. That's in the getRequestedSpeaker method. After we get that ID, it's either going to be a number or the word new. And if it is the word new, we want to do something slightly different here. If we see new, we're going to want to create the speaker right here and then get out. Now, how do we create that guy? Well, we don't have a method for it yet, but we'll go into our refactor mode here and say that inside of our data context speaker repository, we're going to call a method called create. So we'll create a little to-do here. We have to create this create method. And then once we set that, we want to return back this object because we're done. Otherwise, we'll let it fall through and then we'll call it the getById. So now let's go take a look at the speaker repository. That's under services. Right over here, and then we're going to create a create method. But first we'll expose this method, which we have yet to create. We'll scroll down a little and now we'll create it right here. And all we're doing is saying we want to be able to create a new entity of type speaker. So to do that, we're going to call the Breeze Entity Manager, that's this.manager, and it's got a method on it called createEntity. And then it needs to know what the entity name is. which we already have. So that'll create the entity for us. And if we scroll up, we should be able to see the entity name right here. It's actually defined up top as a speaker. So coming back down now, once we create the entity, we also want to return it. So now we have a very simple create method that we can expose from our repository. And this separation makes it nice, so now we can just have the controller call a method on the repository to say, please create the speaker object for me, and then we get it. Now we can remove this to do. We're not quite done yet, but let's test this out just to see if it's working. Now let's go to the speaker screen, and we should see our button up here for add speaker. When we hover over this, notice we've got a URL in the bottom left-hand corner. Go to speaker/new. We'll click on that. It routed over to that URL that we can see up here in the address bar. And right now we have an empty object. And now let's see if we can add somebody. We'll call this person tester. And we'll leave everything else blank for now. And we can see that it saved the data down here. Now that we've created and saved the entity, let's tidy up just a little bit. Let's say that we cancel. Right now the behavior is going to be such that it's just going to cancel the entity and it's just going to stay on the screen. But we want to move off that screen and go back to the speakers page. So let's add in that logic. The way we can check to see if we've actually canceled this new object is we can look at the view model's speaker object, the one we're actually editing right now, and look at its entity aspect. That's a feature that Breeze adds on to all the entities for you. So when you use Breeze, it automatically gives you the plain old JavaScript object, and it adds on this entity aspect to tell you information about the entity. One of the things that we can interrogate on here is the entity state. What's the entity state going to be? Well, we can ask it, is that entity state detached? So what exactly is detached, or how did we get to this point? Well, if we've canceled, saying data context.cancel, we basically just told Breeze, okay, all those changes you just made, get rid of those. So now we have this entity that really doesn't belong to anybody, so it's detached. And in that case, we just want to go back. So we're going to write a little function here called goToSpeakers. And of course, using our refactoring technique, we can just go ahead and add it right down here. So how do we get to that speakers? Well, there's a service that Angular exposes called location, which just wraps the window location. And on here, there's a path method that we can call. And we simply just say, okay, go back to speakers. And whenever I have one-liners, I just kind of put them all in one line like that. And now we got to make sure that we have this location service being injected, which we do not. So we'll add that up top. We'll make sure that it gets put in the proper sequence, and there we go. And now let's test this out. So if we go into the speakers page and we click on add a speaker, now we can type some information here, and let's hit cancel, and it should cancel it and go back to speakers. Exactly what we wanted. Currently, when we go and add a speaker, we've got a title up there of just edit. I'd like it to say edit new speaker. So let's make that happen. So over here inside of the speaker details HTML, we just need to modify the title. And we can see that title down here on line 25. We're using the widget header to say, go call this getTitle function. So we go look at what that getTitle function is inside of our controller. It's actually just performing the logic for us. Now, we don't actually need it to do it this way. We can actually put it right inside of the HTML declaratively. So let's get rid of this function, and we'll get rid of where we're setting it up top and exposing it. It's always nice to delete code, isn't it? Now let's come back over to the title. Now we no longer have this function, but we can put the logic right in line. Let's move to a new line here, and let's type this in. So we always want it to say edit, and then if we have the speaker full name, we want to use that. And if we don't, we'll simply say new speaker. So that's it. We didn't need any logic in the controller to make that happen. Now let's do the same things that we did for speaker for the sessions. So I'm going to the sessions HTML, and we'll add a button down here right below the refresh so we can add a session. And we don't need the click right down here. Instead, we can just use a regular old href. When they click on this, we're going to go to the session view. We already have this route defined, and then we're going to pass in the keyword new. We'll make an icon be icon plus, and we'll say it's add session. And that's all we need for the sessions HTML. Now, when that route is clicked, we want to actually accept that and examine the new or the ID inside of session detail.js. Let's do that next. So down inside of here, we have a method called getRequestedSession. And once again, we'll examine it if it's got the new keyword in it. And then we'll go create the session object through the data context, and it's got the session repository. And then when we get that back, we'll set it to the vm.session, and then we'll return vm.session. So we don't have this data context session.create yet. That's over in the repository. Let's go do that. So here we are inside a repository.session. We're going to need a method in here called create. So we'll expose this, and it'll be the same syntax that we had inside of the repository.speaker. First we grab our entity manager, and then we ask it to please create an entity, and that entity is going to be a session, and then we'll return that. Now it's worth pointing out that we have exactly the same logic here on lines 29 through 31 inside a repository session as we do in repository.speaker. Because we're just calling the entity manager saying, hey, you know what, we're telling you which entity name to actually create, please create it for us and return it. We could push this down to the repository abstract if we wanted to. I chose not to in this case simply because I don't want all repositories to be able to create an entity. For example, the lookups. I don't want them to create a lookup entity. There is really no such thing. In that case, I might want to customize how create works to create a room, a track, or a time slot. In the end, the choice is really up to you on how you want to do it. You could push it down to the repository abstract and then basically override it inside the individual repositories, or you can just leave it up to each repository to implement it the way that you see fit. That's what I chose here. Okay, so now when the session detail calls that create method here in line 46, it's going to get back a session and we're good to go. Now let's implement that cancel logic. So again, if we cancel out, we're going to say, all right, now we have an entity that basically is detached. We want to get out of here. So if our session has an entity aspect, the entity aspect has the entity state, we're going to ask that, hey, are you detached? If you are, let's back out of here. And that go to sessions method is something that we can create. And again, we'll use the location service and call the path on it. And because we're using location, we have to make sure we inject that into the controller. We'll go do that up top. And last but not least, we have to change the title again. So we'll get rid of the get title down here. And we'll go find it inside of our code. Here we go. Let's actually just move that over to our session detail HTML. So here we'll say edit, and then we'll do a binding expression. And if we have the title, we'll use it. If we don't, we'll say new session. And that's it. So now we should be able to add sessions as well. So let's go back to our controller, make sure we've got the code we need inside of session details. We come in here, we've got our location, which we just injected. And now when we go get the requested session, if we've got the ID, it's going to skip over this if statement and actually go get the ID. But if not, it's going to say, all right, if that keyword is new, let's go create that session, return it, set it up. It's going to bind it to the page, and we should be good. So let's test this out. Here we are. Let's open up the DevTools. We'll refresh the cache. And now let's go inside of the sessions. We'll click on the Add Session button. And there's our session object. When we're editing a new session, we give it a title like the test session 1. We come down here to track, notice it's completely empty. Well, it's a little misleading. We actually have the values inside of here. We've got this empty value up top. Well, let's say we selected JavaScript, and we want to go back now and unselect that. Well, notice that empty object is no longer there. So we could actually go through here and select all the items, but we can't go back and deselect any of them. So if we come down here and let's say we missed one of them, like the speaker name, let's go ahead and hit save. We'll get some error messages here like foreign key value cannot be inserted. Yeah, that's kind of yucky. We can actually do a lot better than this. One thing we want to do is add in a null object so that we have an option in the drop-down list to say select a track or select a room or select a time slot. So let's examine the null object pattern. It's going to show us how to do this. We just saw that we had a drop-down list, but we didn't have any item in there that was an empty item that we could select. So for example, we might have a drop-down list here where we've selected JavaScript, but what happens if we want to unselect JavaScript? Can we select that empty item in the list? Well, we need to have an empty item in the list or a non-option. So one way to do that is to create an item in here that says something like select a track when you're choosing a track from a drop-down list. And that's not a real track, it's just a null object. And that's one pattern we can use, this null object or nullo pattern, which allows us to create an item in the drop-down list. So we can start out in that case, like when we add a new session or speaker, and there's a drop-down list in there, we might not have a selection for track. So we'd start off with this nullo option here, the select a track, and then when somebody selects JavaScript or mobile, they can then go and unselect that later by selecting the select a track. And this just helps out with a better user experience. So how do you create these nullos? Well, using Breeze, one of the things we can do is use that same method we used before for manager create entity. So I've put together a create nullo function that shows us first how we can set some initial values. We'll create a property for these objects where the name is going to be set to select a, and then the entity name to lowercase. So maybe select a room or select a track. And then we set the name property because each of those rooms and tracks and time slots all have a name property on the object already. So the create entity accepts in the entity name, and then we can pass in the initial values. Basically, we'll be creating an empty entity where the ID is 0, and that's where we start off. And then the initial values will come in, and the only one we're setting here in this case is name. So basically we're just going to override name to be select a room. Now the third parameter is really important too, because that one's going to basically say this entity state is unchanged. We don't want the UI to say, hey, you've got changes on the screen based upon this entity. This is one of those entities where it really is going to have empty values for all the fields other than the ones that we pass the initial values in for. And the first time we call this, it's going to create the entity ID of 0, which is really an invalid ID. We're not going to be able to use that in the database, but that's good because we don't want it to be in the database. This is a completely client-side entity that we're really just using for the client in the presentation layer to help us with the drop-down list and the user experience, and basically so our objects have that object navigation intact. So a session can have its relationship down to a room or a track or time slot using the nullo. This is a very common and yet simple pattern that we can use to solve this issue. So let's go code it. When we currently run the app and we go to add a new session, we don't see anything in the track, time slot, or room or the speaker. We just have this empty item right there on the drop-down list. We want to use the nullo here, so we have a select a track option in here. So let's go add that. So the place to get the lookups is going to be inside of repository lookup. And we have the method getAll, which is going to get all the lookups. So we're going to go inside of here, and when the query succeeds, we're going to create the nullos on our objects. So we're going to do this inside the model because we're basically going to be dealing with the models themselves and creating a null object. We'll pass in the manager because we're going to need that so we can create these null objects. So that's all we'll need inside of the repository lookup, but now we need to create this create nullos method inside of the model. So let's go create the create nullos method in the model. So we'll come up inside the service and expose the create nullos method. Next, we create the create nullos method. And remember, we're passing in the manager object. Let's flip back over to the repository to see that. Here we can see we're passing in the self.manager. So we have to receive that, which we do. Now let's create a shortcut variable here. This is going to represent the Breeze entity state unchanged. That just helps us from having to type all that out. Next, let's create a function in here to create each nullo that we need, because we're going to have several of them. And for each nullo, we're going to need to know what's the entity name so we can create that, and then what initial values do we want to pass in. Once we get that, we're going to set up the initial values. If we get any in, we'll use those. If not, we're going to basically just put a default value in here for select a, whatever it is. And each of these objects is going to have a name property in there, and that name is going to be select a what? Whatever the entity name is. And we'll make sure we lowercase this, and then we'll tack on the final square bracket and the last semicolon. So if we pass in the values, we'll use those. Otherwise, we're going to basically assume we've got a property called name, and we'll use that. And these will be the initial values we set on the null object. Next up, let's create the entity. And we know that the create entity method is going to accept in the entity name. That might be a room or a track or a time slot. And then we'll also pass in the initial values. And finally, we're going to use the unchanged state. Of course, once we create it, we want to return this. So now that we have our create nullo function, we want to call that for each of our types. Now, which types do we need to actually create nullos for? Well, anything that's going to show up in a drop-down list would be really ideal. So we have this entity names, and then inside of there, we've got the types that we've been using, like time slot. Now let's do the copy and paste here for a couple of them. We're going to have 4. After time slot, we're going to have room. We're also going to have track and speaker. Now time slot doesn't have a name property, so we're going to want to override the initial values. Instead, it's got a start. And that start property, we want to set to something different. In this case, I want to say, well, what's that nullo date? In fact, what start time and date do I want to use basically for that? So we'll create a local variable for this. And then we also want to set up that it's not a session slot. That's a property that this guy has, and we don't want it to show up as a valid session slot. So now let's go ahead and set this nullo date. We'll do that up here. And we'll just create a new date object, and we'll just set it to a de facto date that we're going to use. So now we've got our time slot. The room is going to use the name, which will be select a room. And then the track will use select a track, because we're not going to pass anything for overrides. But the speaker, we want to do something different, because again, it doesn't have a name property. It's got a first name and a last name. We're going to override this and say, all right, well, set up the first name to be select a person. One habit I get into when I want them to show up first in the list is I make sure I've got a space as the first character. So before I do each of these square brackets, I want to have a space before them. Now we're not quite done, but let's go ahead and run it and see what we've got working so far. We'll open up those dev tools, we'll refresh the cache. Now let's go inside of sessions and we'll take a look at those drop-down boxes after we click on add session. So now notice we've got select a track. That's what we expected. Perfect. We've got it for select a room as well, and for select a person, not so great yet. We've also got an issue with the selecting a time slot here. We don't want it to show up as Monday at 5 a.m. So what could be going wrong? Well, we've got a few problems we have to solve. We've also got an issue with the selecting a time slot here. We don't want it to show up as Monday at 5 a.m. So what could be going wrong? Well, we've got a few problems we have to solve. First, let's take care of the time slot. One of the issues we have is that we've got this null date, and when you go down here and register the time slot, we define this property called name. We need to change the way this is being calculated. So right now, we're just saying take the value and go ahead and calculate it based upon the start, and then turn that into the time. Now, that start was going to be the year 1900, and that's why we're getting that time 5 a.m. in there. It just happens to be the time zone I'm in. But what we need to do is we want to find out, okay, that start time, if I take that and I subtract the nullo date, we just want to see if they're different or not. And if they are different, we'll go ahead and do a calculation to see if it's a valid date. And if they aren't different, we're just going to return back select the time slot. But if they are different, then we'll do another check. In this case, we're going to do a little bit of logic here to say, all right, check the start. Then we'll make sure it's actually a valid start date. We'll use the moment library and use its UTC function. We'll grab start, and then we'll check to see, is this valid? It's really nice to have a good date library like moment. So now we're saying, okay, it must be a valid date. If it is, we'll use that same calculation we had before for formatting. If not, and really this should never happen, we'll go ahead and have unknown show up. Let's go ahead and keep that in here, and we'll put the space before each of the square brackets. So that should solve the problem for our time slot. Let's check it out. We'll go back to session, open up the tools, we'll refresh the cache. We'll go into add session, and now we've got select the time slot. Now we have the rooms and time slots and the tracks working for the drop-down lists because of the nullo, but the speakers aren't quite there yet. Now, that can be traced down to inside the session detail controller on line 71. We're going out and getting all the local speakers. And the problem with the nullo is we never told the nullo object, is it a speaker or not? It's a person, but we didn't say it had that is speaker as true. So we need to fix that a little bit and tell it we want to include nullos. So let's pass in a parameter here for getting all local. We'll tell it this parameter is going to signify I want to include nullos, which now means we have to go over to the repository speaker for the get all local and accept in that value. So now that we have that parameter, we have to use it in our predicate. So let's create an if statement here. And if we get that value in, what do we want to do? Well, we're going to take the predicate that we have, which will move this guy up just for a moment. And if they pass in the go ahead and include the nullos, we're just going to tack that on with an or. We're going to say, all right, it's got to be a speaker, or we want to include the nullos. Now, we don't have a predicate for that yet, so let's go ahead and create on the base, the repository abstract, this predicate's called isNullo, just so we don't have to keep retyping it in places. So what's that predicate going to look like? Well, let's go create that. And we'll flip back over to repository abstract. Here, let's create a local variable called underscore predicates. We'll create one here called isNotNullo. And for that, we're going to go ahead and use the Breeze predicate create. And this will create a predicate for us where we're going to tell it the different values. We'll say, all right, this ID is not equal to, and then 0. So that's going to be our isNotNullo predicate. And let's go ahead and create an isNullo just in case we want to use that too. In this case, the ID will be equal to 0. And then we'll expose it right on the constructor's prototype. So now that we've exposed that, we can flip back over to repository speaker. And then right here, we now have this isNullo. So the logic's going to come in and say, all right, if this is true, we're going to say it's always want speakers, but if it's a nullo, we want that too. And for anybody else who is calling this method, if they don't pass in true, they're not going to get the nullo. And quite frankly, we only want this to work in the dropdown. We don't want it to work on the speakers page, for example. So let's run this and see how it works. And again, we'll open up the DevTools, we'll refresh the cache, clear that right out. We'll flip over to Sessions, and then we'll click on Add Session. And now if we scroll down below, we see Select a Person right here. Works perfectly. And also on speakers, we shouldn't see the nullo. We still have 37 to 37 speakers, and we don't have any nullos there. Everybody has a picture. And just to demonstrate why we have all the speakers here but not the nullo, but we have them on the drop-down list, we do include the nullo. If we flip back over to Session Detail, remember we're passing in to get all local the true, which says we want speakers and the nullo. If we go over to the dashboard, which is the other place we're getting speakers, down here in line 67, we're saying go off and get all the local speakers, but notice now we're not passing in a value. That's the same thing in this case as passing in false. We don't want the nullo. And this is perfect because this is where we're actually going out and telling Breeze, go get all the speakers for me, cache them, and then here's my list that I'm going to use. Now it's time to tidy up a few little things here. Let's go in and test out adding a session. We'll create a new session here and let's leave it blank for a moment. We'll click on Save. Here we can see we've got some validation for free, which is a nice feature of Breeze. It sees that title is a required field based on the metadata that came up from the Entity Framework and the Web API in the server. And because it had that information, it's telling you that title is required. Now we'll make this look prettier in a later module so we know all the validation. But something that's kind of bugging me here is that if I type in a title here of, let's say, foo. Now, let's go ahead and cancel this. Notice I got 2 canceled changes down there. Well, I don't really need to cancel it twice. Maybe it's trying to be doubly sure. That means there's a problem. So let's open up the debugging tools, hit F12, and let's find out where it's happening. Now I know that there's a cancel inside of the data context, so let's go check that out in Services. And we'll scroll over here and we can see there's a cancel method. And you can see that it's logging out success of canceled changes. Well, let's hit on that for a moment. And now if we go back into Add Session, let's go ahead and add something as a title and we'll hit Cancel. We see it got hit once. If we look at the call stack, it's being called right there from Session Detail in line 39. That's right there when we hit Cancel, as expected. And then let's go ahead and let it continue running. We'll press this button right here. And then it hit it again. This time it's hitting on Session Detail, line 76. Notice the onDestroy is also calling it. That's because that happens when the controller is destroyed. Now this time, let's go ahead and let it continue running, and we'll get out. We'll also remove the breakpoint. So now we know it's being called twice, but how do we fix it? Well, that's all we have time for, so come back next week. No, we'll fix that now. Let's go over to data context. Inside of cancel, there's some pretty simple code that we can do. We don't need to call the manager reject changes if there are no changes to reject, right? So why bother? So we can do a little bit of guard logic in here and just say, all right, we're only going to do this if the manager has changes. And that's a function, so we'll return back a Boolean value for us. And if there are changes, we'll go ahead and reject the changes, and then we'll log success. And that's it. So now if we run our application, we should be protected. We'll go ahead and refresh the cache, open up the developer tools. We'll go back into the sessions. Let's add a fake session here and let's cancel our changes. And now we should have one canceled change down there. Just a little bit of tidying up, but it helps make your app a little bit more robust. I mean, why bother canceling if you don't need to? It's always nice to put a little spit and polish on your app. So what do we learn in this module? Well, we were trying to make sure we could create objects and then save them. But as we broke that down, we found out there were a couple of mini tasks that we had to take care of as well. One of those is making sure we understood how to route the parameters from the sessions and from the speakers over to the details page, so we knew if it was a new one or if it was one that was already in existence that we were going to update and edit. And for that, we just examined the route param service from Angular. And then we used Breeze to create the new entities off of the Entity Manager object. And we use those entities to help with the dropdowns, but also to help with the object graphs, because each of those objects, such as a session, is going to have rooms, tracks, time slots, and speakers. Those are relations. And when we create a new session, that object graph needs to have some kind of related object for all those objects like time slots and tracks. So we use the null object to fill those in. And it also gave us a nice user experience so the user can see select a track. And they can select it or unselect it, and we'll come back to it later. Then we made sure that all of our queries handled the filtering out of the nullos if necessary, or including them if they wanted them. We used that through predicates. And to accomplish this, we leaned down the repository pattern, so we put the queries and predicates in the appropriate repositories. And then we wrapped up with a few finishing touches to make sure that our cancels only happened once, and we demonstrated how to use the debugging tools inside the Chrome browser to help us get there. And one of the other finishing touches we saw was the validation that we get for free for required fields from Breeze. We didn't have to write any code to get that. Now, do we need all these concepts to be able to add and save new items? Absolutely not. If you remember, halfway through the module, we already had the code in place, and it was already working such that we could add and save them. A lot of building an app is making sure you've got those finishing touches in place to make sure that the user experience is excellent. And that's why we rounded this out with the nullo pattern and the predicates, and making sure we only called cancel once.